so I'm coming to you. Right? One of these days, I'm going to put those $100 bills up here, and you're going to miss out. All right? Well, today we're launching our summer worship series called Can I Ask That? Right? And this summer, we're going to explore some of these questions of faith that sort of, like I said, lurk in the back of our heads. These questions about God, questions about faith, questions about the Bible, questions about some of the things that Christians do that often seem strange or maybe even confusing. And I have to say that I'm really excited about this for two reasons. First off, I'm excited because this is something most churches wouldn't do. This is something most churches wouldn't do. Most churches wouldn't wrestle openly with tough questions of faith. They usually avoid. We have this tendency as people of faith to avoid the tough stuff because the tough questions could bring some disagreement, and disagreement could bring some tension, and tension could lower offerings, and lower offerings means the pastor is flipping burgers at McDonald's. So let's hope that doesn't happen this summer, all right? But seriously, I'm excited about this series, and it has something to do with a few items we found around our house. How many of you are doing some spring cleaning these days? Well, I've got some items around our house. We've been doing some serious spring cleaning. These are family heirlooms that have been passed on from generation to generation. This is from my wife's side of the family, I'm proud to say. Anybody know what this is? What? Well, it's a of course it's a cactus, right? Do you see all the little holes in it? Do you know what it's for? It's a toothpick holder. Why we have this, who's going to stick toothpicks in there? But this is a family heirloom we just can't get rid of, right? Well, there's one. Here's another one from my wife right here. She handed this to me as we were cleaning out the garage. It's still got dust on it. It's her third place trophy from the third grade math contest. Franklin Elementary, Katie Pence, it says on there. Family heirloom, can't get rid of it. Gotta hold on to that. And here are a couple from my side of the family. My grandpa was a custodian, and I have moved this thing 4 times. It says, Survival Supplies by the Office of Civil Defense, Department of Defense, drinking water. It says here, to fill, remove drum cover, follow instructions for filling water storage container, which are packed in box containing the plastic bag liners do not anyway. Do you know what this is from? Yeah, this is like way back. A family heirloom. Why did I hold on to this? I moved it 4 times. And then this is my favorite one. So this is the transistor radio. My grandpa, it has his name right there. Paul Lundby was his name. This thing sat in his shop. And get this, he has the date on here when he bought it, March 29th, 1976. Look at that. The thing doesn't even work. I tried to put batteries in it once. Doesn't even work. Why would I hold on to it? It's a family, it's beautiful. Yeah, right. It's a family heirloom that we just don't know how to get rid of, all these treasures. But what do these random items have to do with this summer series? Well, I think that just like like the ways we hold on, anybody else have stuff like that? I should have asked that. Around your house? Yeah, thank God I'm not alone. I've got a whole garage full of this kind of stuff. Just in the same way we hold on to these old family heirlooms, I think many of us have an old belief that we hold on to kind of the same way. And it's a belief that we just don't know how to get rid of. And I think most of us, we hold on to an old belief about asking questions and about having doubts. Now, raise your hand if you grew up in the Midwest. Raise your hand if you grew up in the Midwest. All right, we should start a support group. many of us, maybe most of us who grew up in the Midwest, we were taught a few lessons about life. And I don't think they were explicit. We learned them implicitly. We were taught to just sort of go with the flow, right? We were taught, I see a lot of heads nodding. We were taught, don't rock the boat. Right? Anybody else taught that? We were taught that respecting other people's opinions means you keep your mouth shut and your opinions to yourself. We were taught to fly below the radar. Don't raise a ruckus. Don't ask too many questions. Don't get too big for your britches. Anyone's grandfather say that to you? Man, huh? I think we all, those of us who grew up in the Midwest, grew up with some of these. And that served us sort of well. But I think for many of us, if you grew up around the church, I think for many of us, this same old belief was true when it came to our faith. Just go with the flow, keep your mouth shut, and don't ask questions. Religion simply is what it is. It always has been, always will be what it is. So you just memorized, right, what the Sunday school teacher, your confirmation pastor told you to memorize. And you didn't dare ask questions like, how did Jonah not get digested in the belly of the whale, right? And you didn't dare ask, how was Noah, when collecting 2 of every animals, how was he able to handle rattlesnakes, right? And what about mosquitoes? You didn't dare ask if Adam and Eve were really naked in the garden, weren't they cold at night? You were taught you just don't ask questions. Just believe it. Even if it doesn't make sense, we don't ask these things. And I think by not being encouraged to ask questions of our faith, something even more tragic happened to many of us. We were led to believe that if you have questions or you have doubts about your faith or about God or about the Bible, they're signs of a weak faith, even a poor faith, a faith that's less than adequate. We've learned never to ask questions because we have this idea that everybody else knows the answer and we're the only dunces in the room who don't know, and we're not quite up to par with that person down the pew. Folks, like all those crazy heirlooms, we don't quite know how to get rid of, right? I think we have this old belief that questioning our faith or the Bible or the church is somehow a sign of a weak faith, and we just don't know how to get rid of it. Now, I know there are some of us that grew up in homes where faith was a sort of a part of our upbringing. While there are others in this room, faith wasn't a part of your life growing up. But you need to know, both my parents spent time abroad serving as missionaries. And so we were sort of this uber church family around our house. My parents served, the church sent them to Japan, where my dad taught by night, or taught by day. He taught English, and my mom was a nurse by day. While at night, they served a church as missionaries. And they spent their evenings telling people about Jesus, who he had never heard before. And as an adult, I've come to realize that this shaped the kind of Christianity I grew up with. And that Christianity went something like this. Being a good little Christian boy meant having all the right answers about God. And if I was going to really fight the good fight of faith all my life, it required defending those right answers at all costs. And somehow, in the home I grew up in and the way I was raised, my security, my self-worth, and my life were all wrapped up in this idea of getting God right. In believing the right things about God, saying the right things about God. And if I really wanted to score points with God, I'd convince others to see the way I saw the right answers about God too. But as I grew up, there's something I realized about faith. Christianity is nothing without questions. Without all those without all those who questioned God and the Bible and the church, I don't know if Christianity would be alive and well today. For example, if you were here last week, from the very moment, you heard how from the very moment the first church was organized in the Bible, we hear how people started questioning things. Those very first Christians, when they gathered, they immediately started to ask, what do we have to do to be Christian? What are the requirements? This was a big question back then because the first followers of Jesus were all Jewish followers who followed all the 600 laws of the Jewish people. When non-Jewish people started to join their ranks, the Bible calls these people Gentiles. They argued and argued and argued over whether or not non-Jewish followers should be required to follow all those laws of the Jewish faith. Had someone not asked a question way back when, we likely wouldn't be here today. In the 16th century, church reformers like a guy named John Wycliffe, he questioned the church's practice of not allowing people to read the Bible in their own language. Martin Luther questioned what seems crazy today, but was common practice way back then. He questioned the church's practice of selling forgiveness. They called it indulgences. There were early Protestants who questioned the practice of requiring people to be old enough that they make a confession before they were able to get baptized. People questioned that, and so today we regularly baptize babies because we believe God loves us before we can even comprehend who God is. Here in America, Christians use the Bible to defend the right to own slaves and to keep women out of leadership roles. And all these were rightly called into question. I could go on and on. Folks, questions have been fundamental to our faith. In fact, I think Christianity was created for questions. Because believe it or not, throughout the Bible, the most famous Bible characters, again and again, they questioned God. From Abraham to Moses to Jonah, Noah, King David, the disciples, they all questioned God. We're going to hear about one today. In the book of John, we hear how Jesus has just died. He died this ugly, gruesome, very public death, and because of this, all the disciples, his early followers, they scattered. They were in hiding because they thought, if those who were in charge did that to Jesus, what are they going to do to us? They all know we follow this Jesus. And that's when we read these words we're going to read for today in the book of John. It says, when it was the evening on that day, the first day of the week, the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Jesus came and he stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them. Isn't that strange? He breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." We're going to stop there. Now, bear with me. If you're following along, if you actually were following along with what we read, you should have all kinds of questions about what we just read. Because there were some weird things that we just read there. First off, dead people don't just come back to life, right? So one might question, what's this all about? Was he like a ghost, or did he look real? Was he cleaned up, or did Jesus look kind of rough? Because the last time they saw him, he looked kind of rough. And why does Jesus say, "Peace be with you," not once, but twice? Why did he breathe on them, right? Did he have fresh breath? Huh? Why? What's going on? And what's this business about forgiving and retaining sins? There should be all kinds of questions after this encounter with Jesus who's come back from the dead. But what's amazing to me is how none of the disciples asked any questions of Jesus at all. Did you notice this? A dead man appears and they ask not a one question. Isn't that odd? Huh? Well, we're going to hear about a guy named Thomas who shows up a little bit late for this party. He didn't get in on this first seeing of Jesus. And if you've been around the Bible a bit, you know, of course, we talked about this. Thomas is known as the doubter, right? So we read here. It says, but Thomas, who's called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." Now imagine what you would be thinking if you were Thomas for a minute. You might rightfully have a few questions for your friends when they tell you a dead man has appeared. Like, what drugs are you on, right? This can't be, right? You might rightfully think your friends are kind of nuts. Dead people are dead. It goes on, it says, but he, Thomas, said to them, the other disciples, help me here, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and place my hand in his side, I will not believe. Did you hear that? Thomas, one of Jesus' closest followers, Thomas calls into question the resurrection. Thomas, one of Jesus' most faithful disciples, he doubts right there the whole Easter story, the story that's sort of important to our faith. But the story goes on in verse 26. It says, a week later his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them, although the doors were shut. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and place it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now, folks, a lot of Christians give Thomas a bad rap, if you ask me. Because for some reason, we've given his questioning and his doubt a bad name. But think about it. When Jesus appears to those disciples after the resurrection, if you were to go back in the story, no one recognizes Jesus right away. Mary Magdalene, the first to see Jesus at the tomb, she thinks that he's the gardener, right? When Jesus appears later to these male disciples, they don't recognize him either until he shows them his hands and his side. But Thomas wasn't there for any of this. And so when the disciples tell him this crazy story about how Jesus visits them, he calls it all into question. He says he won't believe until he sees for himself. And poor old Thomas gets labeled the doubter when it seems like he has more than ample reason to question things. Now, let me tell you, this is more than a little strange, because if you were to see the other story, there's only one other story in the Bible where Thomas speaks. And if we were to go back to that story, get this, there he is portrayed not as a faithless loser, but as the bravest, most loving and loyal and faithful friend Jesus has. In that story, a guy named Lazarus passes away, he dies, and two women, Mary and Martha, they beg Jesus to come back to them in Judea, but all the disciples try and talk Jesus out of it, saying, "No way, Jesus, don't you remember the Jews were trying to stone you there, and you want to go back?" But Thomas, the only Thomas, he pipes up and he says, "Let's go. Let's go with him. If we die, we die with him. I'm in this with Jesus," he says. All the other disciples were saying, "No way," but Thomas was willing to die alongside Jesus. Folks, we make Thomas out to be this faithless one whose faith was somehow lacking. We make him out to be this embarrassing disciple who in the end couldn't get his act together, when the reality was he was the only disciple willing to die for Jesus, faithful to the end. And I think we see this faithfulness on full display when he calls those disciples into question. Folks, what if we were able to see Thomas's questioning and his doubting of the resurrection, not as an objection to faith, not as a sign that Thomas's faith was inadequate. His doubt wasn't an indication that his faith was lacking or eroding or incomplete or poor. Rather, what if we were able to see Thomas's questions and doubts as signs of a deep and passionate faith? That Thomas loved God so much that Thomas wasn't going to take those bumbling disciples' word for it. He was going to get to the bottom of things because Jesus was that important to him. So important that he was going to question and doubt, and he was going to wrestle until he was satisfied. Isn't that what we do when we deeply believe in something or someone? For example, if we believe in our kids that they've been wronged, for example, we're not going to listen to easy answers. We're going to meet with the principal and the coach and the teacher and find out what's going on. Thomas's questions and their doubts aren't a sign of a deficient faith. They're signs of a deep, deep faith that isn't going to stand for easy answers. Folks, as we dive into this summer series, I want you to know something. If you're at all like me and maybe you have a few questions about faith, a few doubts maybe about God or the Bible, about Christianity, you need to know that these questions and these doubts aren't somehow antithetical to faith. They aren't signs of an inadequate faith or a poor faith. In fact, if you ask me, they're the exact opposite. They were the exact opposite for Thomas, and they're the exact opposite for you and me. You see, our questions and our doubts are actually, I think, signs that you really care about this faith business. They're signs that you want to